Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 3, Sundown. A little housekeeping before we get started. Thanks to everyone for all of the wonderful feedback on the first two episodes. It really means a lot to see folks sharing and enjoying the show. After much demand, I've also started uploading these to YouTube, though sadly YouTube is very rude about even playing 20 seconds of Gordon Lightfoot for a joke, so there are very slight differences in the edit. Still, if folks subscribe on YouTube or on any platform and leave a nice comment wherever comments are allowed, it really does help with getting the podcast out there, and more importantly, it makes my day. So thank you all very much. Now, this is the second part of the Akhenaten story, so make sure to go listen to the first part in Bible Lore Podcast Episode 2, Praise the Sun, to get the full story. I'll bring in a couple more clips of my interview with scholar Dan McClellan here as well, and if you're interested in our full interview, check out patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast.
You take these kind of de facto differences and then you center them and hold them up as the essence of our identity over and against the others. So it's a way to create those boundaries. So, like today, back in the 70s, you had Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and others engaged in this intentional campaign to try to take opposition to abortion and turn that into an identity marker precisely so that they could rile up the silent majority and create the religious right so that they could win political power in an effort to try to win back their right to keep black kids out of evangelical universities and things like that.
So make sure to check that out. Last time, we journeyed through the beginnings of New Kingdom Egypt, reaching one of its pinnacles with Pharaoh Akhenaten, who utilized a time of stability and prosperity enjoyed by many of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean and Mesopotamian states to consolidate power around himself and away from the Amunist priesthood of Thebes to his new capital in Akhenaten, along the way making himself the sole vessel to his favored manifestation of the almighty sun god, the Aten. This time, Akhenaten, the Aten, and even the magnificent city of Akhenaten will crumble into the dust, and from the ashes, some of the most famous pharaohs of all time will arise. I left the last episode on a cliffhanger with a plague tearing through Egypt around a dozen years into Akhenaten's reign, and that's probably what happened. There's that word again, probably. Once more to really hammer home what I hinted at last time, Akhenaten's life has been significantly speculated on by scholars over the past couple of centuries, ever since the expeditions of Napoleon and the subsequent excavations of Akhenaten at Amarna. But Egyptologist Redford cautiously points toward the idea of a plague that was ravaging Mesopotamia being brought to Egypt, possibly during Akhenaten's big Year 12 Durbar celebration. In this celebration, representatives from as far as Hattusa, that is, the Hittites of modern-day Turkey, brought tributary payments. Or maybe these representatives caught the disease from their time in Egypt and brought it back to West Asia. Either way, it's always nice to be invited to the late Bronze Age equivalent of a COVID super spreader party, where you're also expected to bring along a chunk of your own people's wealth. Regardless of whether this probable plague arrived from a foreign land or was homegrown, though, it ripped through Egypt and set the stage for the chaotic final chapter of Akhenaten's reign. Whether the pandemic is what killed Akhenaten's mother, Queen Tiye, in Year 12, we don't know, except that she died. Whatever else happened during these final 5 years after the celebration, the later pharaohs and their administrations that followed destroyed as much as they possibly could, doing their best to erase all memory of this aberration from the historical record, and significantly hampering our ability to piece it all together. While they weren't able to wipe out the first decade or so of Akhenaten's reign, at least not to the same extent, the history of whatever climax or nadir occurred has been figuratively and literally shattered into so many pieces that almost everything from here on out is still subject to being overturned at any point in the next decade or so by new archaeological finds. For an example of how quickly parts of Akhenaten's last dance can be overturned, let's turn to his marriage. There'd long been speculation that Nefertiti and Akhenaten divorced, or she had been disgraced, and that perhaps she had fallen victim to the epidemic, maybe. The hypothesizing got pretty wild at times, with scholars pointing to one piece of art where rays emanating from the sun disk didn't fully reach Nefertiti, indicating some kind of marital disagreement, I guess. But a 2012 discovery of a graffito from the 16th year of Akhenaten's reign shows them still together, still married, just around a year before he died. One of the few pieces from that period that seems to have escaped the censor's hammer. Her depictions in the distinctive Atenist art style of the time are striking and prevalent, and extremely elevated. The art itself is an interesting digression, too.
And even within the art, there's an interesting thing within the art that you see from this time period. A lot of Egyptian art before and after was very idealized. There was specific kind of standard motifs and forms and patterns that you used in your art, and people, and particularly pharaohs, were represented in very idealized, formulaic ways. And then in comes Akhenaten, and suddenly you've got kind of softer Egyptian bodies. They got little guts on them. Their facial features are more realistically portrayed. And even the art gets a little more realistic to some degree, a little more stylistic in another direction. But this was also something that some Egyptians just really didn't like, and so kind of returned to the classical figures after Akhenaten was dead.
Scholars and art historians seem torn on whether the Atenist style sucks or rocks. I'm not an art critic, and my perspective is that it's cool someone tried something different. Feel free to roast the Atenist art style if you're a hater, though. There's little better in life than finding something to be a hater about. But anyway, with that fairly recent revelation of Nefertiti's status in mind, what I would like to stress before we get into these last few years, before Atenism in all its forms is ground into the dust, is that most of this is a speculative reconstruction. If this whole period is the subject of speculation, this is the place where we're on the rockiest footing. On the rest of the family front, pharaohs of this dynasty, and this is really annoying, didn't tend to list their sons or portray them in inscriptions and art, which means we don't know for sure who Akhenaten's sons were, or even if he had any. And even if his successors hadn't tried to delete Akhenaten, we still may not have known much about them. That said, we do know that Akhenaten and Nefertiti had an eldest daughter, Aten, and her husband, the mysterious Menkaure, was also elevated to something near the end of Akhenaten's reign, possibly his designated heir, possibly even as his co-regent. Because it wouldn't be right for this drama to lack some more incest. Smenkhare may have been Akhenaten's younger brother, thus making Smenkhare's wife his own niece. The plague killed at least 3 of the royal couple's daughters, including the second eldest, leaving Aten and the third eldest daughter, Aten, as the oldest of the royal bunch. Around year 13 or 14, Akhenaten took the step of raising Nefertiti's already elevated status to king. That is to say, she seems to have been co-pharaoh with Akhenaten, with the royal name Neferu Aten, meaning effective for her husband. In this society, that seems to be more of a compliment than we're used to, seeming as the pharaoh was himself significantly deified, even more so than usual in Akhenaten's case, but it does read a bit funny in our modern time. Hey honey, guess what? I'm raising your status and giving you a new name that emphasizes even more how much you're a fan of me. Now, perhaps their son-in-law Smenkhare was still supposed to rule after Akhenaten's death, with Nefertiti remaining in an elevated regent role as a royal advisor, similar to the way his own mother, Queen Tiye, continued on after Amenhotep III died. Either Smenkhare or Nefertiti or both seem to have been established as co-regents, like we've seen several times in the show so far. The idea is that it's even easier with a ruler who's getting long in the tooth to deal with that all-too-prickly issue of succession if you've already got not only an heir lined up, but a co-ruler who requires little additional coronation or common acceptance. Ideally, you can essentially skip most of the whole peaceful transfer of power question. Old king dies, new king's already on the throne. In Hammurabi's case in our first episode, his father simply stepped down when his age finally caught up to him and his health started failing. And as we saw earlier, the long-reigning woman pharaoh Hatshepsut may have made her regency too smooth and pissed off her son in the process by not stepping down after he came of age. But whatever Akhenaten's elevation of his family members, whatever his intentions and plans for succession, we will likely never know exactly what happened. all we can say for sure is that something went catastrophically wrong. Akhenaten died in the mid-1330s, in his 17th year on the throne. He was probably in his 30s. His body was laid to rest in Akhetaten, not in the Valley of the Kings, and the artwork in his tomb is not only of the realistic Atenist art style, but also a departure in content from the typical Egyptian royal tombs. What I mean is that Akhenaten was apparently not concerned with traditional Egyptian focus on the afterlife, as much as the ethics of older Egyptian royal cult and even the Aten itself had their roots in Egyptian society. For once in the history of the pharaohs, death was simply ignored. Soul weighed against a feather? I guess not. The sequence of events that followed his death and burial has a dozen or more possible permutations. Did son-in-law Smenkhare die before Akhenaten, or did he take the throne afterward for a few months before dying himself? Did King Neferu-Aten die before Akhenaten, or did she take the throne afterward? Did neither of them die before Akhenaten, and then one ruled, died, and the other took over, ruled, died, etc., etc.? Let's go with this. Akhenaten died, son-in-law Smenkhare took over, but he became ill. In Smenkhare's dire state, one of Akhenaten's other daughters, Ankhesempa Aten, and her husband and possibly half or full brother, more incest for ya, Tutankhaten, made their bid for the throne. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. That feels about right. Whether it was a coup or Smenkhare died of natural causes, we don't know. But at this point, things start to get a bit clearer and the fog begins to lift. However he ended up in power, in the middle of all of this bedlam and death, the teenage Tutankhaten became pharaoh and decided to make peace with the cult of Amun and end what would soon be seen as the Atenist heresy. Probably he and his advisors had even garnered support for their coup from the wealthy and spurned Amunists in Thebes. With their backing, upon taking the throne, Tutankhaten mirrored and reversed Akhenaten's Amun to Aten name change by doing an Aten to Amun name switch for himself, dubbing his wife Ankhesen Amun and himself Tutankhamun.
I don't think it was Ramses. I believe it was Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun?
Yes, he's that King Tut. His ascension seems to have been orchestrated by the Vizier A, who may have been his great-uncle, brother to Akhenaten's mother, Queen Tiye. Perhaps A had friends among the Amunists and utilized these connections in secret to bolster their case for restoring not only order in the midst of a tumultuous period, but the Amunist cult itself. Hey guys, things have gotten pretty ugly. Want a place back in the royal palace? All you gotta do is back this teenager. Tutankhamun's actions seem to support this, as he took the throne, moved the royal capital back to Memphis, the legendary city of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and resumed funding of the Amunist cult and temple in Thebes. He abandoned Akhenaten, which has, once again, left us with a treasure trove of documents called the Amarna letters. That's how we can reconstruct most of this. Everywhere else, though, the process of scrubbing Akhenaten's stink off the kingdom began. The Aten, so high and mighty above all the other gods, would never see much daylight again. Atenist temples were torn down, stripped for parts and gold that would be restored to other cultic centers around the kingdom. King Tut projected military power by bolstering ties with Mitanni, located in modern-day East Turkey, one of the chief rivals of their neighbors, the Hittites. He even went on a military campaign into Syria-Palestine against the Hittites under the direction of his father's military advisor, Horemheb, a stark contrast to the overall détente his forebears had enjoyed. The Cold War was starting to heat up. Tutankhamun is famous, though, not because of a long and storied reign, but because in 1922 CE, just over 100 years ago, his tomb was excavated with not only his undisturbed mummy, but also his ornate golden funerary mask still intact, rare for a site that has been a target of grave robbers for 3 millennia. It's maybe the most iconic piece of Egyptian archaeology. It set off a new wave of Egyptomania in America, especially, part of a long and storied tradition of a rediscovery of ancient Egypt's magnificence leading to a cultural obsession, which had also happened 100 years before in the 1800s, and even happened in ancient Greece and Rome. For thousands of years, people have loved falling in love with ancient Egypt. In this early 20th century example, apocryphal stories of the excavators being cursed by disturbing Tut's tomb resulted in the classic universal horror feature The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. Tut himself remained a star for most of the century, visiting various museums around the world and often in America. A minor flare-up of Tut mania in the 1970s had a marketing campaign that was considered so all-absorbing that it led to the Steve Martin SNL song King Tut, which is nearly indecipherable in the modern absence of this Egypt obsession.
One of the great art exhibits ever to tour the United States is the Treasures of Tutankhamun, or King Tut. But I think it's a national disgrace the way we have commercialized it with trinkets and toys, t-shirts and posters.
King Tut,
Buried with the donkey! He's my favorite honky!
born in Arizona, moved to Babylon.
The sketch itself is making fun of Egyptomania. That's basically the whole joke. Now, at least, you can understand why your grandparents thought that was the funniest sketch they'd ever seen. Of course, us younger folks also have humor that might not age well as its context fades, so don't judge too harshly. The boy Tut's reign itself ended with his death less than 2 years after he'd become pharaoh. At some point, he seems to have broken his leg, maybe in battle. A subsequent infection and probably an existing case of malaria ensured he didn't make it much past age 19 or so. Or maybe he was murdered as part of a conspiracy, though that view doesn't seem popular among more recent scholars I've read, because they no longer believe someone smacked him in the back of the head like they used to. More medical investigation has made that seem pretty unlikely. Upon Tut's death, his advisor A took over as pharaoh. And when I say A took over, it should be heard in scare quotes, because, I mean, come on. He was probably the one directing most of Tutankhamun's moves, at least domestically. A is certainly the cui bono of Tutankhamun's death, and it points to him, if anyone, at the center of a plot to kill Tut and take over. More likely, though, Tut's death was an accident of history, and A was just a lifelong striver and climber who managed to enjoy the luck of being in that place at that time and picking Tutankhamun as an effective successor to Akhenaten's apparently chaotic death. I mean, increasing your chances at being the right guy in the right place is half the point of getting so close to power, right? But there was a roadblock to A's ambitions. Horemheb, the general King Tut had taken such a liking to, and who he may have even included in his succession plan in some fashion, though it's pretty unclear. It's entirely possible Horemheb invented the whole "Tut wanted me to be emperor next, actually" story. A, like any scheming vizier worth his salt, attempted to supplant Horemheb's closeness to the throne and installed another general, Nakhtmin, in his place, adopting him as his son, though, once again, we don't know that much. It's possible Nakhtmin was his biological son. Regardless of his provenance, A set Nakhtmin up as the heir apparent to the throne, possibly in contradiction with Tutankhamun's wishes. But Horemheb hadn't just fallen off the turnip truck, and when the old man A died just a couple of years into his reign, it would be Horemheb, not Nakhtmin, who was the last king of the 18th dynasty. At some point in this game of musical thrones, a peculiar episode occurred in which a Hittite prince received an invitation from an Egyptian pharaoh's widow, probably Tutankhamun's wife, Ankhesenamun, to wed her in Egypt. Now, between a queen asking for a prince's hand in marriage and the desire for him to come to her homeland, this was a truly bizarre offer, and rather irregular for how these kinds of international marriage arrangements typically went down. But the Hittites came to accept the offer. Remember, whatever minor military incursion Akhenaten had made along the eastern Mediterranean coast, if any, it had failed to drive them out. And so to them, this offer of marriage looked like a prime opportunity to put an official stamp on the southern boundary as they saw it. And with King Tut's military campaigning into the Levant, a potential return to the previous détente looked pretty good. They even sent an envoy to double-check, make sure that it was legit. And when the envoy came back and said, yeah, it's a real offer, absolutely, totally real, the Hittite king sent his third son, the Spare, off to Egypt. During the journey, however, someone, perhaps an Egyptian faction that was displeased with the heterodox arrangement, ambushed the royal caravan and murdered the prince. Or maybe the whole thing was a hoax, an extremely elaborate one, with envoys being in on it, and the whole thing was just done from the Hittite side. We don't know. No matter who orchestrated the assassination, though, one thing was clear. The era of diplomacy-first engagement with the Hittites was disintegrating. Pharaoh Horemheb, however, could make no real immediate response to Hittite retaliation in the Levant when he took over from A. Egypt was still in a state of disarray, with him being one of up to 5 pharaohs in around a decade. While Tutankhamun had restored the ominous temple, Horemheb went even further, elevating it but installing his own men as its top priests, attempting to ensure that the kind of independent, ominous priesthood grip that Akhenaten had fled from and tried to starve out would not gain parallel power again. Removing this temptation to upset the cultic and political order for future pharaohs was a smart move. To sell this, though, he also began a more thorough campaign of desecration of all things Aten and Akhenaten, going even further than Tutankhamun and removing Akhenaten's name and family from any and all inscriptions in a process that makes Akhenaten's own censorship of Amun look like child's play. Akhenaten's tomb was smashed into hundreds and hundreds of tiny pieces, a perfect example of how brutally desecrated his memory would become. Hatshepsut was practically honored in comparison. To avoid a succession crisis, Horemheb installed one of his trusted generals, Paramesi, as his heir. Horemheb ruled for around 15 years, restoring stability after a pretty rough decade for Egypt, and when Paramesi ascended to the throne, he followed Sean Parker's advice from the Social Network. Drop the pa. Just Ramses. It's cleaner. Ramses I marked the beginning of the 19th dynasty, the famous Ramessides who would continue warring against the Hittites and shredding any memory of Akhenaten. Let's pause on the history for a moment to catch our breaths and talk about names. At the beginning of this journey, I told you there was almost certainly no Exodus, at least as the Bible describes it. And that's true. But there's still the possibility of some relatively minor group of Levantine slaves or otherwise depressed laborers escaping from Egypt. Like Bertrand Russell's famous teapot, which we all agree orbits around the Aten in the heavens, it's pretty hard to prove a negative. And there are a couple of things worth discussing regarding some kind of minor Exodus-like event. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence comes from the name of the big man himself, Moses. Sharp-eared listeners may have noted the similarity between names like Ahmose and Tutmoses and, well, just Moses. This is not a coincidence. While one explanation is that the author simply made up an Egyptian-sounding name, it's entirely possible that the name Moses is in fact an Egyptian name that is missing its theophoric element, its god. Ahmose means Yah, the moon god, is born. Moses on its own in Egyptian would mean is born and might even be considered an incomplete name. So it's possible that Moses' name was censored by the authors of the biblical texts because the theophoric element wasn't Yahweh or El Shaddai. For a founding figure like Moses, Yah Moses or El Moses would be fine, but Tutmoses or Amun Moses or Ra Moses would simply not do. Aaron, the name given to Moses' brother, is likewise an Egyptian or Egyptian-ish name, but he's even more problematic because it's possible and even likely that he was added to the text later for theological reasons. More on Moses and Aaron's literary aspects in a later episode. Even so, if there was some small group of escaped laborers or slaves from Egypt, or possibly some Egyptian-controlled area, it would be extremely difficult to tell in archaeology, especially if it wasn't a significant event to the Egyptians. And because the biblical descriptions of the Exodus are so legendary in nature, and the numbers so hyperbolic and inflated, and the vast majority of the texts themselves much later, there's almost nothing we can recover about historical Moses with any confidence, outside of what seems to be part of his name, missing even the God that he honored. Scholar Richard Elliott Friedman argues, mostly based on textual evidence from the Bible itself, which, it's true, is problematic, I know, but he argues that if there was an Exodus, it would have been just the Levites, a priestly class sometimes referred to as one of the tribes of Israel, who would come to some prominence in the middle of the first millennium BCE. Moses and Aaron are Levites, and the Levites in the Moses narrative do have Egyptian or Egyptianish names like Moses and Aaron. Friedman's book, The Exodus, is one of the more interesting arguments in favor of something historical in the Exodus, and I recommend checking it out, even if, like me, you're still skeptical that there's any there. The reality is that there was subjugation of the land of Syria-Palestine by the Egyptians. There were various periods where pharaohs bragged about taking Levantine captives and using them as slaves. There was a pharaoh who himself engaged in the kind of one-god reform that seems to echo in later expulsion of other gods in the Judahite pantheon, and Egypt did extract heavy imperial tribute from its subjects while often offering little in return in the way of protection from raiders or rival kingdoms. Of course, whether anything specific from these historical realities echoed through time and past the Bronze Age collapse to give us the Exodus story, some small historical nugget like the Trojan War, or if it's entirely a folk tale based on the broader experience of Egyptian hegemony that reached into the Iron Age period and then popped up again after Alexander's conquests, that's probably unknowable. I think there's something to it, but it's important to be very cautious about reaching anything close to a firm conclusion when our data is so weak, problematic, and limited. Centuries after Akhenaten's demise, years after he'd been erased from the Egyptian historical record by the Ramessides, while Amun-Re sat comfortably in his restored spot at the top of the pantheon, the official state cult of the Kingdom of Israel and or Judah would undergo a similar campaign to the Amun-Re conflation in order to stress that two previously disparate gods, El and Yahweh, were actually the same, much like Amos of the First did. In the Pentateuch, or Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, one recurring theme seeks to stress that Yahweh and El Shaddai are the same, with the god being called El all the way through Genesis. The author emphasizes this repeatedly, and the narrative reaches its climax in Exodus 6, where the writer delivers the theological plot twist of his narrative as he's giving Moses his instruction to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Quote, God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself known to them. But Hayden, you say, I opened up Genesis and the name Yahweh is all over it, usually rendered in English as the Lord. And that includes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knowing this name. What gives? Good point. This, among many duplications of stories with different conflicting retellings, led scholars in the 1800s to realize that the Torah, as we have it, is made up of at least 4 previously independent sources that were weaved together by a later hand, probably multiple hands, perhaps as a way of preserving these sacred texts despite their contradictions and repetitions. These were holy texts. We're going to keep all of them, even if there's a bit of tension in there. We don't know exactly when the conflation of El Shaddai and Yahweh happened, as it can only be gleaned through some careful readings of the biblical texts, but it may have been within just a few hundred years of the Ramessides taking power. While Egypt reached the heights of its golden age, it did so as part of a vast trade network spanning from Afghanistan to Greece to Ethiopia, before the rather rapid disintegration of this sprawling civilization, starting around 100 years after Akhenaten's death. The infamous Bronze Age collapse is what we'll be discussing next time. As a preview, though, let's bring Dan back in. So what did the Amarna letters tell us about the general area of Canaan and broader Syria-Palestine during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten?
They tell us that there was an awful lot of bickering going on. You have city-states that are run by these petty kings, and they're under the hegemony of Egypt. And so basically Egypt is the parent, and these are the kids who are like, he crossed over into my territory and he won't stop touching me, and make him do this and make him do that. And you've got a lot of whining to the Egyptian pharaohs who are just like, ugh, this again. They're really annoyed with these folks. But it paints a picture of a land that is occupied by little petty kingdoms, by chiefdoms that there's no central hierarchy to speak of. There's certainly no early Israel occupying any of these territories. Like, we have Jerusalem is represented, Bethlehem is represented in the text, and they're overwhelmingly Canaanite. At least that's the characterization that scholars usually default to. Canaanite isn't really an incredibly useful category, but that's what's going on there. And Egypt is just, they have hegemony there. They have rule over that area. And it's a constant source of annoyance for the Egyptian crown. You see some different names of folks that are Northwest Semitic languages. So some of the names sound an awful lot like biblical names. None of them are actually biblical, because one, we don't have the Hebrew language yet. It wouldn't exist for a few more centuries. And we don't have any nation of Israel at this point. The earliest reference of any kind to a people known as Israel comes from around 1208, 1210 BCE with the Merneptah stele, where Merneptah crows about having defeated them and treats them as if they're, they've been wiped off the map. But the determinative, the Egyptian little indicator of what type of noun they are, doesn't identify them as a city-state. Like some of the other places around Israel, it identifies them as a people, which means they were probably not a centralized nation or state. It was probably just a collection of tribes, maybe a temporary confederation, an amphictyony or something like that. So they don't really reveal much at all about the people of Israel, but reveals a bit about the situation in that land of Canaan and its later periods, where we begin to see a context in which the people of Israel begin to pop up.
Within these texts, there are discussions of a Habiru people there, some sort of classic type of hill-dwelling raiders who come down to make trouble for folks living in the lowlands in cities and towns. Is there an etymological connection to the term Hebrew, as some scholars have proposed?
I would suggest that the Hapiru are not etymologically related to the Hebrew word that later is manifested as Ivrit, the Hebrew. Certainly there is some similarity there, and certainly people can see some overlap in the idea of these kind of nomadic people who are causing trouble to the actual city-states and the authority figures that are in those areas, and the people of Israel, the Hebrews that are thought to be there. But I think the consensus view is that there's no etymological relationship there, and that the word Hebrew primarily comes from a verb meaning to cross over. These are the ones from over the Jordan, or on the other side of the Jordan. And this probably goes back to the traditional idea of Abraham coming from the other side of the Jordan, whereas Hapiru is more of it's not so much an ethnic designation as kind of a functional designation. These are the nomads that are the invaders, the troublemakers.
And so we reach the end of our exploration of the Amarna period and Akhenaten's heresy/palace coup. Akhenaten is an endlessly fascinating figure. He was an ambitious reformer who sought to wrest power from the ominous priests, and his famous poem honoring the Aten would somehow, probably very, very indirectly, influence one of the psalms that saw Yahweh as a solar deity in some way. The end of his mostly successful reign shows that these reforms, however, had essentially no staying power. Whatever reality there was to the Judahite King Josiah's reforms 700 years later, and it's frankly debatable how much they existed, his impact was not rejected, at least not by everyone, despite the utter collapse of the Judahite kingdom after his death. Unlike Josiah, though, Akhenaten had the opposite legacy, a complete societal repudiation of everything he did and stood for, an embarrassment in art, cult, and politics whose failure at the end ensured that in all three of those spheres, there would be, for better or worse, an attempted return to the old ways and a deletion of everything Akhenaten. In art, I'm not one to say whether the Atenist style was worth keeping around. Some love it, some hate it. That's art criticism. In cult, The Ramesside dynasty attempted to control the ominous cult and install loyalists repeatedly, but something curious happened. A broad decentralization, possibly caused by Akhenaten's defunding of the city temples, seems to have given rural priests more influence that lasted throughout the Ramesside period. The cities never really reached the heights they were at, again as far as cult goes, in temples and shrines. Akhenaten's absorption of all praise as a direct vessel to his big, all-encompassing god seems to have had a blowback effect. And his even more advanced elitism ended up leaving a vacuum filled, ironically, by a more egalitarian cult in Egypt that undermined later state cult officials. On the political front, it's hard to say whether Akhenaten's failure is what caused a return to warring between the Egyptians and the Hittites, because in the century after his death, the entire massive cross-empire trade network and associated political systems of the broader civilization began to contract and then collapse during the 12th century. Perhaps the desire to return to war by Akhenaten's successors rejecting his diplomatic policies was one early domino in the chain, but we'll have to explore that more next time when we talk about the coming of the Sea Peoples. Now, speaking of the Sea Peoples, before I leave you, there's just one more thing.
One other thing.
There are two poems that are considered by many scholars to be the oldest in the Bible. The Song of Deborah in the book of Judges, which describes an early unification of some Israelite tribes to attack and defeat a king of the Canaanites. The other, more relevant for our topic today, is the Song of the Sea, found in Exodus 15. For both of these poems, dates have been given that range wildly between the 11th century BCE and the 3rd century BCE, a full 900 years. I tend to see them as somewhere in the middle, maybe 8th century or so, but I'm not an expert. In the archaic or perhaps pretend archaic language, the author, with Moses as his literary mouthpiece, describes and praises Yahweh's victory over Pharaoh, starting out with this: "I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Intriguingly, the author affirms the existence of other gods besides Yahweh. But just like in the hymns to Aten and Amun-Re, he uses the rhetoric of incomparability to attempt to elevate Yahweh over them, saying, "Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders?" But despite its potential age, dating perhaps to the first half of the first millennium BCE, there's something curious a couple verses later, when the author starts talking about how afraid the other nations are of Yahweh's power and might. "The peoples heard, they trembled. Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia." Now, Philistia, however, is anachronistic here, as Robert Alter notes in his commentary on the passage. The Philistines, called Pelashet by the Egyptians, and who form the etymological roots of our word Palestine, would not arrive in Canaan until the 12th century BCE, and it took some time for them to become the kind of significant, established society that would remain a thorn in the side of Israelites in their early years. But next time, we'll talk about all of that. Ugarit, Lebanon, the Philistines, the Sea Peoples, and the infamous Bronze Age collapse. Thanks again to Dan McClellan. Make sure to pre-order his upcoming book, The Bible Says So. All of his links, as well as this week's sources, are in the description for this episode, and you can listen to my full interview with Dan on the Patreon at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. See you next time.